A seat for kindness. The shrill beep of Jasmine Carter's alarm clock shattered the early morning stillness. Groaning, she reached a hand from beneath her blanket, blindly smacking at the clock until the noise ceased. For a moment, she lay still, cocooned in the lingering warmth of her bed, reluctant to surrender to the responsibilities of the day. But time waited for no one, least of all her. Slowly, Jasmine sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dim morning light seeping through her worn-out curtains. She blinked away the last vestiges of sleep and glanced at the small wooden desk in the corner of her tiny room. Piles of notebooks, loose papers, and well-loved novels were stacked haphazardly atop it, a testament to her passion for writing. Her lips curled into a small smile as she traced the spine of a book she had read countless times, its pages worn from hours of turning. A voice drifted from the kitchen, warm yet weary. "Jasmine, breakfast is ready." "I'm coming, Mom," she called back, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. She dressed quickly, pulling on her school uniform, a slightly faded blue blouse and pleated skirt that, despite its age, she took great care to keep neat and presentable. A glance in the small mirror hanging on the wall confirmed that her dark brown curls were tamed into a ponytail, and her chocolate-colored skin glowed softly under the morning light. Satisfied, she grabbed her backpack and hurried into the kitchen. Her mother, a woman whose beauty had been slightly dulled by exhaustion, stood over the stove flipping the last piece of toast onto a plate. The bags under her eyes spoke of long hours at work, yet she greeted Jasmine with a warm, if tired, smile. "Morning, sweetie," she said, pressing a light kiss to Jasmine's forehead. "Eat up. You've got a long day ahead." Jasmine sat at the table and picked up a slice of toast, her appetite dulled by the stack of overdue bills resting near the salt shaker. She knew their financial struggles all too well. Money had been tight for as long as she could remember, but lately, it seemed like they were barely keeping afloat. College, a dream she had clung to since she first fell in love with books, felt more and more like a distant fantasy. Her mother caught her staring at the papers and sighed, her expression softening. "Don't worry about that," she murmured. "We'll figure something out." Jasmine forced a smile and took a bite of her toast. "I know, Mom." She finished her breakfast quickly and slung her backpack over her shoulder. "I have my shift at the grocery store after school, but I should be home by 7. "All right, just be safe," her mother said. "And don't forget to dream big." Jasmine nodded, stepping out into the cool morning air. The city was already stirring. Cars honked in the distance, people bustled down sidewalks, and birds flitted between the branches of trees lining the street. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day settle onto her shoulders, and started toward the bus stop. The bus was already packed when Jasmine climbed aboard. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, gripping the metal pole for balance as the driver pulled away from the curb. The familiar hum of morning commuters surrounded her, people tapping away on their phones, others staring out the window, lost in thought, and a few students like herself huddled together, whispering about an upcoming test. Jasmine exhaled and let her mind drift to her latest story idea. She had been working on a novel in secret, pouring her thoughts into it during late-night hours when the world was quiet. It was the kind of story she wished she could live, one of adventure, mystery, and endless possibilities. But here, in the real world, there was no magic waiting to whisk her away. Only school, work, and responsibilities. A sudden movement caught her eye. An elderly woman had just stepped onto the bus, gripping the handrail tightly. She was small and frail, her silver hair neatly pinned back. A deep purple jacket draped over her shoulders, and a large leather purse dangled from her arm. She swayed slightly as the bus jolted forward, struggling to maintain her balance. Jasmine glanced around, expecting someone to offer her a seat, but everyone was either too distracted or too indifferent to notice. Her stomach twisted. She hated how people could be so absorbed in their own worlds that they ignored simple acts of kindness. Without hesitation, she pushed past a few people and approached the woman. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Would you like my seat?" The elderly woman's tired eyes flickered with surprise before settling into gratitude. "Oh dear, that's very kind of you. Are you sure?" Jasmine nodded. "Of course. Please, sit." With a small, relieved sigh, the woman lowered herself into the seat. "Thank you, my dear," she murmured. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Jasmine simply smiled, gripping the overhead rail as the bus continued its route. A warmth spread through her chest, a rare feeling of doing something good, even in the smallest way. She didn't expect anything in return, nor did she need it. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, the elderly woman fumbled through her purse, her fingers digging into its depths. After a moment, she pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Jasmine barely noticed until the woman gently tapped her hand. "Jasmine, dear," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come here for a moment." Curious, Jasmine leaned in slightly, and the woman pressed the paper into her palm. "This will change your life," she said, her eyes twinkling with something unreadable. "Trust me." Before Jasmine could ask what she meant, the bus lurched to a stop. The woman stood, offering her a knowing smile. "Remember, dear, sometimes the most unexpected things lead us exactly where we need to be." And with that, she shuffled off the bus, disappearing into the crowd. Jasmine stared at the crumpled note in her hand, her heart pounding with an odd mix of excitement and unease. What could it be? A simple thank you message? A piece of advice? Or something more? Her fingers itched to unfold it right then and there, but something held her back. Instead, she carefully tucked it into her backpack, her mind buzzing with possibilities. As the bus continued toward school, Mrs. Anderson's words echoed in her head. "This will change your life." Jasmine had no idea just how right she was. The note that changed everything. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation as she walked through the school hallways. The weight of the crumpled note in her backpack, a constant reminder of the mystery waiting to unfold. The early morning chatter of students echoed around her, lockers clanging open and shut, the scent of cheap perfume and cafeteria coffee lingering in the air. Normally, she would have been preoccupied with thoughts of her upcoming English essay or the pile of grocery store inventory she'd have to sort later that evening. But today was different. Today, there was a secret burning in her pocket. She had spent the entire bus ride resisting the temptation to unfold the note, to satisfy the gnawing curiosity that had taken root in her chest. But something inside her whispered that it wasn't just a simple message. Mrs. Anderson, if that was even her real name, had seemed too certain, too knowing. "This will change your life." But how? Jasmine slipped into her homeroom, settling into her usual seat by the window. She glanced at her best friend, Lily, who was already scribbling something in her notebook, her fingers moving furiously. The moment she spotted Jasmine, Lily's eyes flickered with mischief. "You look like you saw a ghost," Lily whispered, leaning in. "Spill." Jasmine hesitated. She knew Lily. The moment she shared this secret, there would be no turning back. Lily would push her to investigate it, to take the mystery and run with it. And maybe that's exactly what Jasmine needed. She pulled out the crumpled paper from her backpack, unfolding it slowly as Lily's eyes widened. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky. The ink faded as if the message had been written long ago. It was short, just an address and 5 simple words beneath it. "Come find me. It's time." Jasmine swallowed. "I don't even know what this means." Lily snatched the paper from her hands, her gaze flickering across the writing. "This is like crazy. Who gives a random note to a stranger on the bus? And what does 'it's time' even mean?" She gasped suddenly, her eyes widening. What if she's a secret millionaire looking for an heir? What if she's like the last member of some ancient book cult, and she's choosing you as the next leader? Jasmine rolled her eyes. Or maybe she just wants to thank me for giving her a seat. Lily shook her head, grinning. "No way, Jas. This is fate. You have to go." Jasmine chewed her lip, staring at the note again. Her logical side screamed caution. What if this was just some weird prank? Or worse, what if it was dangerous? But her heart told a different story. She had always dreamed of adventure, of stepping beyond the ordinary routine of her life. Could this be it? Could this be the moment everything changed? The final bell rang, jarring Jasmine from her thoughts. Lily nudged her. After school. We're going. Jasmine sighed, tucking the note back into her bag. Fine. But if I get kidnapped, I'm haunting you. Lily grinned. Deal. A journey into the unknown. The walk to the address was longer than Jasmine expected. The sun had already begun its descent, casting golden hues across the sky, stretching shadows across the sidewalk. Lily walked beside her, practically vibrating with excitement. This is literally the most exciting thing that's happened in weeks, Lily said. Maybe months. Jasmine smirked. Gee, thanks. Glad my life is finally entertaining you. I mean, it's true. Usually, it's school, work, stress, repeat. But today, we're about to uncover a mystery. Lily elbowed her playfully. So, what do you think this is about? Be honest. Jasmine exhaled, watching the address on her phone's map inch closer. I don't know, but I want to find out. The neighborhood they entered was old but well-maintained, lined with towering trees and brownstone houses. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. Jasmine's pulse quickened as she spotted the address up ahead. It was a bookstore. Nestled between a small cafe and a florist, the shop had an old-world charm about it. A wooden sign above the door read, Anderson's Books and Treasures. Lily stopped in her tracks. Wait. Hold on. Is this her store? Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Anderson. The woman from the bus. This wasn't just a random address. It was her bookstore. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jasmine stared at the entrance, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. She could almost hear Mrs. Anderson's voice again. This will change your life. What are you waiting for? Lily nudged her forward. Go. Jasmine took a deep breath and stepped inside. A hidden world of stories. The scent of old books and polished wood wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stacked with books of every genre imaginable. Soft lighting bathed the space in a golden glow, and a cozy reading nook sat near the back, complete with worn leather chairs and a crackling fireplace. It felt magical. A bell chimed as the door swung shut behind them. From behind a towering bookshelf, a familiar voice called out, Ah, you came. Jasmine turned, her stomach flipping as Mrs. Anderson emerged from the back of the store. She looked just as she had on the bus. But here, in the heart of the bookshop, she seemed different. Stronger. Like she belonged here. Jasmine took a cautious step forward. I got your note. Mrs. Anderson smiled warmly, gesturing toward the shop. Welcome to my world, dear. Lily whispered, Okay, this is straight up a movie. Mrs. Anderson chuckled, moving toward the front counter. I imagine you have questions. Jasmine nodded. A lot. Mrs. Anderson gestured to a pair of chairs near the fireplace. Then sit, and let's begin. Jasmine hesitated before lowering herself into one of the chairs, feeling like she had stepped into a story of her own. Lily plopped down beside her, eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Anderson took a slow breath. I've owned this shop for over 50 years. This place is my life, my heart. But time, as you can imagine, has not been kind to me. My hands aren't as steady as they once were. My legs tire faster. And I've been looking for someone. Jasmine frowned. Someone. Mrs. Anderson met her gaze. A successor. Silence settled between them. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Jasmine shook her head. Wait. What? Mrs. Anderson smiled gently. I saw something in you, Jasmine. A love for stories. A kindness that this world desperately needs. And I believe you are meant to be here. to carry on this shop's legacy. Jasmine's thoughts swirled. But why me? Mrs. Anderson leaned forward, her gaze steady. Because sometimes fate chooses us before we even realize it. Jasmine swallowed hard. She had always dreamed of working with books, of surrounding herself with stories. But owning a bookstore, becoming part of something bigger than herself, she wasn't sure if she was ready. And yet, a small voice inside her whispered, "What if this is the story you were meant to live?" The weight of a dream. Jasmine sat frozen in the old leather chair, her fingers gripping the worn armrests as Mrs. Anderson's words echoed through her mind. "I want you to take over the bookstore." The idea seemed so impossible, so big, that Jasmine felt like she had been thrust into the pages of a novel she wasn't prepared to read. She had dreamed of being surrounded by books her entire life, of writing her own stories. But this was something else entirely. She finally found her voice. You want me to run this place?" Mrs. Anderson chuckled softly, as if she had been expecting the disbelief. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. I've been searching for someone who understands what books truly mean. Someone with a heart full of stories. And when you gave up your seat for me on that bus, I saw something special in you." Jasmine felt Lily elbow her gently, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay, this is officially the coolest thing that's ever happened." Jasmine shot her a look before turning back to Mrs. Anderson. "But I'm 17. I have school. I work at the grocery store. I don't know the first thing about running a business." Mrs. Anderson smiled knowingly. "No one is born knowing how to do something, Jasmine. We learn. And I will teach you. If you choose to accept, you won't just be inheriting a store. You'll be inheriting a legacy. A place where stories come alive, where people come to escape, to learn, to dream." Jasmine swallowed, her heart pounding. "Why me? Why not someone older, someone more experienced?" Mrs. Anderson's gaze softened, because passion is more important than experience. "And you, my dear, are passionate." The room was silent for a long moment. Jasmine's mind raced, torn between fear and excitement. This was insane, completely insane. She barely had enough time to finish her homework some days. How could she possibly run an entire bookstore? But then she looked around. At the shelves stacked high with books, some older than she was. At the handwritten signs indicating sections like forgotten classics and stories that change lives. At the cozy reading nook by the fireplace where, for decades, customers had curled up with books and found comfort within these walls. And something inside her whispered, "This is where you belong." The weight of responsibility. Jasmine didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind consumed by possibilities. The logical side of her screamed that this was ridiculous. She was still a teenager. She had no money, no business experience, and her mother would never approve. But her heart kept replaying Mrs. Anderson's words. This place is more than just books. It's a home for stories, for people, and it can be yours. When morning came, Jasmine felt like she had aged 10 years overnight. She had to tell her mother. She had to see if this was even possible. The conversation went about as well as expected. "You want to what?" Her mother stared at her in stunned silence, gripping her coffee mug like it might shatter in her hands. Jasmine took a deep breath. "Mrs. Anderson wants me to take over her bookstore. Not immediately, but she wants to train me. She thinks I have what it takes." Her mother exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "Jasmine, this is crazy. You have school. You have your job. How do you expect to balance all of that and run a business?" Jasmine had anticipated the concern, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I know it's a lot, Mom, but I love books. This is everything I've ever dreamed of." Her mother sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I know you love books, sweetheart, but love doesn't pay the bills. A bookstore is a business, not just a place to read." Jasmine swallowed hard. "I understand that. But what if this is my chance to build something? To create something real? Her mother's eyes searched hers for a long time before she finally sighed. "We'll talk about it, but I want you to think this through, Jasmine. This isn't a hobby. It's a commitment." Jasmine nodded, hope flickering in her chest. That wasn't a no. The first lesson. After school, Jasmine returned to Anderson's books and treasures, her nerves twisting like a storm inside her. Mrs. Anderson greeted her with a warm smile. "I had a feeling you'd come back." Jasmine sat across from her at the wooden counter, taking a deep breath. "I want to learn." Mrs. Anderson's smile widened. "Then let's begin." The first lesson wasn't what Jasmine expected. There were no discussions about bookkeeping, no talks of inventory. Instead, Mrs. Anderson led her to the shelves. "Before you can run a bookstore, you need to understand it," she said, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "Tell me, what do you see?" Jasmine frowned, unsure how to answer. "Books." Mrs. Anderson chuckled. "Look closer." Jasmine hesitated, then let her eyes roam the shelves again. She noticed the careful way some books were arranged in clusters. Thrillers next to detective novels. Fantasy books with ornate, eye-catching covers placed at eye level. Well-worn classics given prime spots on display tables. "It's intentional," Jasmine murmured. "The way they're placed." Mrs. Anderson nodded. "Every book has a story, but how we present it matters. Readers are drawn to stories that call to them. Our job is to make sure they find them." Jasmine glanced at the counter, where an elderly man was flipping through a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Across the room, a mother and her son were browsing the children's section, their hushed voices full of excitement as they picked out a picture book. This wasn't just a bookstore. It was a place where people came to feel something. Jasmine turned back to Mrs. Anderson, something shifting in her chest. "I get it." Mrs. Anderson smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Good. Now let's see if you can recommend a book to your first customer." An unexpected connection. Jasmine's heart pounded as she approached the counter. The elderly man looked up, his wrinkled hands gripping the book as he studied her. "Do you need any help finding something?" she asked hesitantly. He studied her for a moment before glancing down at the book. "I've read this one a dozen times," he murmured. "But I can't seem to put it down." Jasmine smiled. "It's a classic." He chuckled. "That it is. But I'm looking for something different. Something that makes me feel the way this book did the first time I read it." Jasmine hesitated, her mind whirring through possibilities. Then, suddenly, she knew. She walked to a nearby shelf and plucked a book from it before handing it to him. "The Book Thief," she said softly. "It's about words, about stories, and how they change people. I think you'd like it." The man studied the book, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said. "She always knew exactly what I needed." Jasmine felt warmth spread through her chest. "I hope she's a reader." "Oh, she is," he chuckled, placing the book on the counter. "And I think you're going to do just fine here, young lady." Jasmine turned to Mrs. Anderson, who stood watching with a knowing smile. The realization settled deep in Jasmine's bones. She belonged here. And maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was meant to be. A new chapter begins. Jasmine Carter was no stranger to hard work. She had spent years balancing school, helping her mother at home, and working part-time at the grocery store. But running a bookstore, that was something entirely different. It had been a few weeks since Mrs. Anderson had offered her the chance of a lifetime. At first, Jasmine thought she would just be shelving books and helping customers. But she quickly learned that owning a bookstore was about so much more than that. It was about people. It was about stories. It was about dreams. Mrs. Anderson had begun teaching her everything: how to manage inventory, how to place book orders, even how to recognize different kinds of customers. Jasmine soaked it all in, but the more she learned, the more she realized how much work it would take to keep this place running. Still, she loved every second of it. A secret plan. One Friday afternoon, As Jasmine finished reorganizing a display of mystery novels, Mrs. Anderson walked over with a thoughtful look. "You've been doing wonderfully, my dear," she said warmly, adjusting her glasses. "I can see how much this place means to you." Jasmine beamed. "I love it here. It feels like home." Mrs. Anderson nodded, pleased. "And that's exactly why I have something very important to discuss with you." Jasmine's stomach flipped. "What is it?" Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking about retirement." Jasmine nearly dropped the book in her hands. "Wait, what?" Mrs. Anderson chuckled at Jasmine's wide-eyed look. Now, don't panic. I'm not leaving right away. But I am getting older, and I can't run this place forever. It's time for me to start preparing for the next chapter of my life." Jasmine's heart pounded. She had known this moment would come eventually, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. Mrs. Anderson continued, "And that's where you come in, Jasmine. I want to start transitioning ownership to you." Jasmine felt like she had been hit by a truck. "Mrs. Anderson, I don't know if I'm ready for that." Mrs. Anderson smiled gently. "No one is ever truly ready for big things, dear, but you are capable. I believe in you." Jasmine looked down at the book in her hands, running her fingers over the cover. "But what about my mom? She's already worried about me working here. I don't think she'll be okay with me taking on everything." Mrs. Anderson nodded in understanding. "Which is why we're going to take things one step at a time. I don't expect you to handle everything overnight, but I do have an idea to make things easier." Jasmine tilted her head. "What kind of idea?" Mrs. Anderson's eyes twinkled with excitement. "A grand reopening. Reviving the bookshop." The idea was simple but brilliant. They would breathe new life into Anderson's books and treasures by reintroducing it to the community. A fresh start. New events. A reason for people to walk through the doors and fall in love with books again. Jasmine's mind raced with ideas. We could host an author reading. Maybe a children's story time. And what about a book exchange where people can trade their old books for new ones? Mrs. Anderson nodded approvingly. "I love those ideas. And I have another thought. We should redesign the store a bit. Give it a fresh feel." Jasmine's excitement bubbled over. "We could add a cozy reading corner with soft chairs, and maybe a small section where people can leave book recommendations for others." The two of them spent hours planning, sketching out ideas, and brainstorming ways to make the store feel alive again. Jasmine took notes furiously, jotting down every detail. By the time they finished, they had an entire event planned. The grand reopening would take place in 4 weeks. Now, all they had to do was make it happen. The hard work begins. For the next several days, Jasmine threw herself into the preparations. She spent her mornings at school, her afternoons at the bookstore, and her nights studying for upcoming tests. It was exhausting, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was working towards something that mattered. She and Mrs. Anderson sent out flyers to local businesses, put up posters at the grocery store, and spread the word online. Jasmine even reached out to her English teacher, Mrs. Thompson, who promised to tell her students about the event. The community responded almost instantly. People started coming into the shop more frequently, curious about the changes. Some offered to donate books for the event. Others signed up for the reading club Jasmine was starting. It was happening. The bookstore was coming back to life. But it wasn't easy. Jasmine quickly learned that running a business meant dealing with problems, like the time a huge box of books arrived damaged and had to be returned, or the day the store's old cash register malfunctioned right in the middle of a busy afternoon. Still, every challenge only made her more determined. And Mrs. Anderson was there, guiding her every step of the way. A difficult conversation. One evening, as Jasmine collapsed onto her bed after another long day, her mom walked into her room. "Sweetie," her mother said softly, sitting down beside her. "We need to talk." Jasmine's stomach tightened. "I know. It's about the bookstore." Her mother nodded. "I see how hard you're working, Jasmine, and I can tell you love it there. But I need to understand, why does this mean so much to you? Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Because it's more than just a bookstore, Mom. It's a place where people feel safe, where they discover new worlds through books. And Mrs. Anderson, she's giving me a chance to be part of something real. Her mother was silent for a moment before she sighed. I just worry about you taking on too much. You already work so hard. Jasmine reached for her mother's hand. I know, but this doesn't feel like work, Mom. It feels like home. Her mother studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. Okay, if this is what you really want, I won't stand in your way. Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat. Really? Her mother smiled. Really? Relief and excitement flooded Jasmine's chest. This was really happening. The grand reopening. The day of the grand reopening arrived faster than Jasmine could have imagined. She stood outside the bookstore with Mrs. Anderson, staring at the crowd that had gathered. People from all over the community had come, families, teachers, old customers, and even some of Jasmine's classmates. Mrs. Anderson smiled at her. Are you ready? Jasmine took a deep breath and nodded. Ready. With that, they opened the doors. The event was a dream come true. Kids gathered in the reading corner, adults browsed the shelves, and local authors held book signings. Jasmine moved through the store, helping customers, recommending books, and feeling more alive than she ever had before. Toward the end of the day, Mrs. Anderson pulled her aside. You've done something incredible here, she said, tears glistening in her eyes. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. We did. As she looked around at the bustling bookstore, the laughter, the stories being shared, she knew. This was just the beginning. The turning point. The grand reopening was more than just a bookstore event. It was the start of something much bigger. Jasmine felt it in every interaction, in every smile, in every customer who walked through the door that day. She had always been a dreamer, but for the first time, she wasn't just imagining a better future. She was building one. As the last few guests filtered out of the bookstore that evening, Jasmine stood in the center of the shop, taking it all in. Bookshelves stood neatly arranged. The reading nook was full of cozy cushions and twinkling fairy lights, and the air still buzzed with the magic of the day's events. Mrs. Anderson stood beside her, watching her with quiet admiration. You did beautifully, my dear, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jasmine exhaled, still slightly overwhelmed. I still can't believe how many people showed up. It was amazing. Mrs. Anderson chuckled. That's because you made them believe in this place again. Jasmine looked around, noticing the small details, the handwritten book recommendations customers had left on the community board, the stack of novels in the local favorites section that had nearly sold out, the group of children who had begged their parents to bring them back next weekend for another storytime session. For the first time, the weight of responsibility felt less like a burden and more like a gift. The future of Anderson's books and treasures. Over the next few days, the bookstore remained busy. Customers returned, some purchasing books they had discovered during the reopening, others coming just to experience the atmosphere again. Jasmine noticed how different people found comfort in the shop. Some came in looking for inspiration, others for a quiet escape from their busy lives. It wasn't just about books. It was about belonging. Jasmine had never been more certain. She wanted to do this. She wanted to make this place a home for book lovers, for dreamers, for anyone who needed a safe place to land. One evening, as they were closing up, she turned to Mrs. Anderson. I think I want to make this official. Mrs. Anderson raised a knowing eyebrow. Oh. Jasmine took a deep breath. I want to take over the bookstore. For real. I want to learn everything I need to know so that when the time comes, I can make sure this place keeps going. Mrs. Anderson's smile widened, pride shining in her eyes. I knew you'd come to that decision. Jasmine blinked. You knew. The old woman chuckled. Of course, I've seen it in you since the day we met. Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't fear anymore, it was excitement. A new kind of adventure, a new kind of dream. Mrs. Anderson reached out and gently patted her hand. Then we'll start making it official, bit by bit. Jasmine nodded, determination filling her heart. She was ready. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she belonged. And it was right here. The weight of a promise. Jasmine stood outside Anderson's Books and Treasures on a crisp Saturday morning, staring at the hand-painted wooden sign that hung above the entrance. The name carried so much weight now, more than just letters arranged on a board. It carried history, stories, dreams, and now it carried her future. It had been a few weeks since the grand reopening, and the bookstore was thriving. The cozy little shop that had once been nearly forgotten was now a community hub, filled with life, laughter, and the quiet, endless hum of turning pages. But with its success came the daunting reality of what she had signed up for. Mrs. Anderson had started training her seriously now, not just in the daily running of the shop, but in the deeper aspects of business, the things Jasmine had never thought about before. Finances, inventory, marketing, taxes. It was more than she had imagined, and with each passing day, she began to realize just how much responsibility she was taking on. And yet, she wouldn't trade it for anything. The challenges of running a bookstore. Monday afternoons were usually slow, the kind of day where customers trickled in, lingering over shelves rather than making quick purchases. Jasmine used the quiet hours to go over the bookstore's inventory. Mrs. Anderson had given her the daunting task of checking the sales from the past month, comparing them to what books they had left in stock. Jasmine stared at the long list of titles, numbers blurring together. Okay, so we sold 25 copies of The Book Thief, and only 5 of The Midnight Library. Does that mean we should order more? Or will it slow down next month? Her head hurt just thinking about it. She sighed and glanced at Mrs. Anderson, who was carefully dusting a shelf nearby. How do you know what to reorder? Jasmine finally asked. Mrs. Anderson smiled. You learn to recognize patterns. Pay attention to the seasons, to trends. Holidays bring more sales. School assignments mean classic novels will fly off the shelves, and some books. She patted a hardcover copy of Pride and Prejudice. They always sell. Jasmine jotted down notes. She had never realized how much strategy went into this. But what if we guess wrong? She asked. What if we order too much and it doesn't sell? Mrs. Anderson chuckled. Then we get creative. Host a themed event, offer discounts, or turn those books into gift bundles. There's always a way. Jasmine nodded, determination growing inside her. She had a lot to learn. Balancing dreams and reality. As much as Jasmine loved the bookstore, she quickly learned that running it came with sacrifices. Her grades were starting to slip. Not by much, but enough that she noticed. Enough that her mother noticed. One evening, as Jasmine sat at the kitchen table with her textbooks spread around her, her mother placed a cup of tea beside her and sat down. We need to talk, sweetie. Jasmine sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. I know. You're worried about my grades. Her mother studied her for a moment before nodding. Yes, I am. And I'm worried about you. You've been working nonstop between school and the bookstore. When was the last time you just relaxed? Jasmine hesitated. She couldn't remember. Her mother reached out and took her hand. I see how much this means to you, and I'm proud of you. But you have to take care of yourself, too. Jasmine swallowed the lump in her throat. I don't want to mess this up, Mom. Mrs. Anderson is trusting me with everything. Her mother squeezed her hand. And you won't. But you have to find balance. Maybe it's time to ask for help. Jasmine frowned. Help. Find people who can support you. Maybe someone else can take on a few shifts. Maybe Mrs. Anderson can handle some of the harder tasks until you finish school. Jasmine thought about it long after her mother went to bed. She didn't want to let anyone down. But maybe she did need to ask for help. A team effort. The next day, Jasmine brought it up to Mrs. Anderson. "I think I need some extra help," she admitted, shifting awkwardly. Mrs. Anderson smiled knowingly. "I was wondering when you'd realize that." Jasmine blinked. "Wait, you knew." Mrs. Anderson chuckled. "Of course, dear. No one runs a bookstore alone. I've been waiting for you to see it for yourself." Jasmine exhaled, a mix of relief and embarrassment flooding her. "So, what do we do?" Mrs. Anderson reached for a notepad and started writing. "We hire a part-time assistant," she said simply. "Someone to handle the front desk when you're at school. Someone to help with shelving and organizing. And if you're lucky, someone who loves books as much as we do." Jasmine smiled. "I know just the person." Lily joins the team. Lily practically screamed when Jasmine told her about the job opening. "You mean I get paid to hang out in a bookstore? With books? And you?" Jasmine laughed. "Yes, basically." Lily threw an arm around her. "Best job ever." With Lily on board, Jasmine felt like a huge weight had been lifted. She now had someone she could trust to keep things running when she wasn't around. And Lily, she brought a whole new energy to the shop. She rearranged the front table with fun themes, enemies to lovers, a classic trope, started a blind date with a book section, and even convinced Jasmine to create an Instagram account for the store. Within a week, they had over 200 followers. "You're welcome," Lily said smugly. Jasmine laughed. "I take back every time I doubted your marketing skills." With Lily's help, business started booming even more. The bookstore wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. An unexpected opportunity. One quiet afternoon, Jasmine was restocking shelves when the little bell above the door chimed. A well-dressed woman stepped inside, her eyes scanning the store with keen interest. Jasmine recognized her instantly. Lisa Parker, a reporter from the Oakville Gazette. She had written an article about the grand reopening, but Jasmine hadn't expected to see her again. Lisa smiled warmly. "Jasmine Carter." Jasmine wiped her hands on her jeans and nodded. "That's me." Lisa extended a business card. "I wanted to reach out because your story has inspired a lot of people. We're doing a feature on young entrepreneurs, and I'd love to do a full interview on you in the bookstore." Jasmine's breath hitched. An article about her, about the shop. Mrs. Anderson walked up behind her, resting a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Go on, dear. Say yes." Jasmine swallowed hard. Then, finally, she smiled. "I'd love to." A legacy in the making. As Jasmine sat down with Lisa for the interview, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. She had gone from a girl struggling to balance school and work to someone on the verge of running a business. She had learned about responsibility, about teamwork, and about the importance of asking for help. And now she was helping to shape something bigger than herself. Lisa clicked on her recorder. "So, Jasmine, tell me, what's next for Anderson's Books and Treasures?" Jasmine smiled, glancing at Mrs. Anderson, at Lily, at the shop that had become her second home. "Well," she said, "this is just the beginning. The final chapter of a new beginning." Jasmine sat in the cozy reading nook of Anderson's Books and Treasures, fingers tracing the worn edges of a leather-bound notebook. The bookstore hummed with quiet activity, pages turning, soft murmurs of customers discussing their latest finds, and the gentle clinking of a coffee cup from a patron in the corner. The once-forgotten store had transformed into something vibrant, something alive, and she had helped make that happen. It had been months since Mrs. Anderson had handed her that fateful note on the bus. Months of learning, of growing, of discovering just how much passion, sacrifice, and heart it took to run a bookstore. But it had all led here, to this moment. Tomorrow, she would officially sign the papers. The bookstore would become hers. The thought sent a thrill of excitement and terror down her spine. Was she really ready? Could she really do this? She had asked herself that question 100 times over the past few weeks, but she still hadn't found an answer. And maybe that was the scariest part of all. Mrs. Anderson's goodbye. The transition had been gradual, but now it was real. Mrs. Anderson had begun stepping back, letting Jasmine take the lead. At first, Jasmine had stumbled, ordering too many copies of a book that didn't sell, forgetting to update the store's financial records, nearly losing an entire shipment due to a miscommunication with the supplier. But Mrs. Anderson had been patient, guiding her through every mistake. And now she was ready to let go. One evening, as the store was closing, Mrs. Anderson handed Jasmine a set of keys, the official keys. Jasmine swallowed hard, staring at the tiny pieces of metal in her palm. So this is really happening. Mrs. Anderson chuckled. It is. Jasmine met her mentor's gaze. Are you sure you want to do this? You love this place. Mrs. Anderson's eyes softened. And that's exactly why I'm leaving it in your hands. Jasmine exhaled shakily. I'm scared. Mrs. Anderson smiled knowingly. That means you care. Jasmine bit her lip. But what if I mess up? Oh, you will, Mrs. Anderson said with a wink. That's part of the journey. But I trust you, Jasmine. And this shop, our shop, is going to thrive because of you. Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never thought of the store as hers before. But hearing Mrs. Anderson say it, believe in her so completely, it was overwhelming. Mrs. Anderson placed a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder. And don't worry, dear, I won't be far. You'll always have me for advice. But this, she gestured around the store. This is yours now. Jasmine clenched the keys in her fist, trying to steady herself. This was it. A new chapter. A celebration to remember. Jasmine had insisted on throwing a farewell party for Mrs. Anderson. Not farewell, she corrected when Lily suggested making a giant goodbye banner. Just a thank you. The day of the event, the bookstore was packed. Customers, book lovers, old friends of Mrs. Anderson. They all came, each person carrying a book to donate in Mrs. Anderson's honor. The thank you table was overflowing with heartfelt notes, flowers, and well wishes. Jasmine stood at the front of the shop, scanning the room. Mrs. Anderson, sitting in her favorite chair, looked overwhelmed by the outpouring of love. Jasmine cleared her throat, raising her voice so the room could hear. Everyone, can I have your attention? The chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to her. Jasmine took a deep breath. I just want to take a moment to say thank you. Not just to Mrs. Anderson, but to all of you. When I first walked into this store, I had no idea how much it would change my life. But now, I can't imagine my life without it. She turned to Mrs. Anderson, emotion tightening her throat. You built something incredible here. You created a place where stories come alive, where people can escape, where dreams are born. And I promise, I'll do everything I can to make sure that legacy continues. Mrs. Anderson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, smiling warmly. I know you will, dear. The crowd erupted into applause. And in that moment, standing in the heart of her bookstore, Jasmine knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. The start of something new. A week after officially taking over the store, Jasmine sat at the counter, flipping through the pages of her notebook. It was filled with new ideas, new possibilities. A monthly book club. A section dedicated to local authors. A young writers program for aspiring storytellers like her. The shop was already changing, evolving into something uniquely hers. The bell over the door jingled, and Lily walked in, balancing 2 coffee cups. You look way too serious, she said, handing Jasmine one. Business stress. Jasmine smirked. More like business excitement. Lily slid onto the stool beside her. So, boss lady, what's next? Jasmine glanced around the store, a slow smile spreading across her face. Everything. She had no idea what the future would hold. There would be challenges, mistakes, and tough decisions. But there would also be stories, friendships, and moments like this, where she felt alive, where she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. And that was enough. As Jasmine sipped her coffee and opened the bookstore for another day, she realized something. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning.